The clatter of silverware on porcelain is the soundtrack to Kathy Dawson's life, a rhythm she knows by heart. For 5 years, she's been a ghost in this upscale dining room, serving dreams she can no longer afford to the city's elite. But tonight, one ghost from her own past will walk through those doors, a man whose face she sees every morning in the eyes of her son. She thought he vanished from the face of the earth. She was wrong. He's been here in this city, living a life of luxury, while she's been struggling to survive. And in a few moments, she won't just be serving him his dinner. She'll be serving him a truth he abandoned 5 years ago. The Tuesday night shift at Aurelia was usually a predictable affair. It was the calm before the storm of the weekend, Russia night for serious-faced business dinners and quiet, affluent couples. For Kathy Dawson, it was a night of familiar motions: the precise fold of a napkin, the practiced smile, the balancing act of a tray laden with seared scallops and filet mignon. The air hummed with hushed conversations and the expensive scent of truffle oil and old money. Kathy moved through the tables with an efficiency born of 5 years of practice. Her brown hair was pulled back in a tight professional bun, not a strand out of place. Her uniform, a crisp white shirt and black trousers, was immaculate. To the patrons of Aurelia, she was part of the decor, a functional and forgettable element of their fine dining experience. That's how she preferred it. Anonymity was a shield. Her section was nearly full. A quartet of lawyers at table 5, celebrating a victorious settlement. A young couple on a nervous first date at table 6. And then there was table 7, a party of 3. She'd taken their drink order without really looking at them, her focus on her notepad on getting the ridiculously specific martini order correct. Grey Goose stirred exactly 10 times with a single hand-stuffed blue cheese olive. Make sure the olive isn't bruised. As she delivered the drinks, placing the perfect martini in front of the man who ordered it, her eyes finally lifted from the tray. And the world stopped. The air in her lungs solidified. The low hum of the restaurant faded into a deafening roar in her ears. The heavy tray in her hand suddenly felt weightless. Time, which had been marching forward relentlessly for 5 years, snapped back, throwing her into a summer that felt like a lifetime ago. The man was Christopher Preston. He looked different, yet achingly the same. The sandy blonde hair that used to fall boyishly into his eyes was now expertly styled shorter, more severe. He wore a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than her car. The laughter lines around his eyes were deeper, but the eyes themselves were the same, a startling crystalline blue. The kind of blue you see at the heart of a glacier. The kind of blue she saw every single morning when she looked at her son. He hadn't seen her. He was laughing at something the older, powerfully built man beside him had said. The woman with them, elegant and dripping in subtle diamonds, placed a proprietary hand on his arm. She looked like she was born to sit in places like Aurelia. Kathy felt a hot, bitter wave of nausea rise in her throat. "Is everything all right, miss?" The older man asked, his voice a low grumble of authority. Kathy blinked, forcing the world back into focus. "Yes, sir. My apologies." Her voice came out as a strangled whisper. She set the remaining drinks down with a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly and fled toward the sanctuary of the kitchen. She burst through the swinging doors, the chaos of the kitchen, a welcome assault on her senses. The clang of pans, the hiss of the grill, the shouted orders. It was noise she could understand. She leaned against the cool metal of a prep station, dragging air into her lungs. "Kathy, you look like you've seen a ghost," Maria, her friend and fellow waitress, said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I think I have, Kathy," breathed, pressing her palms against her eyes. "Maria, it's him," Maria's sharp features softened with immediate understanding. There was only one him in Kathy's life. Him, you mean? Leo's father, Kathy, nodded, unable to speak. The story was one only Maria knew in its entirety. The whirlwind summer romance 6 years ago. Kathy, a 22-year-old art student on scholarship waitressing for the summer. Christopher, a 24-year-old business prodigy, supposedly on a break before taking over a major division of his family's global logistics company, Preston Corp. It was a fairy tale. He wasn't like the other rich kids she'd met. He was kind, funny, and genuinely interested in her art. He'd told her he loved her. They'd made plans. He said he had to go to Singapore for a 2-week business trip to appease his father, and then he'd be back. They would figure everything out. He never came back. His phone number was disconnected. The emails she sent bounced back, address unknown. He had simply vanished. 2 months later, a positive pregnancy test turned her world from tragic to terrifying. She'd dropped out of school, lost her scholarship, and picked up every waitressing shift she could get, all to build a life for the son he would never know. No way, Maria whispered, her eyes wide. After all this time, he's out there. What's he doing, eating? Kathy said, a hysterical laugh bubbling in her chest. He's out there eating a $12 olive and laughing with his fiancée or wife or whatever she is. What are you going to do? I don't know, Kathy said, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to run out the back door and never return. Part of her wanted to storm out there and scream to shatter the perfect, polished world he was sitting in. The image of Leo's face flashed in her mind, his gapped-tooth smile, the way he'd proudly shown her his latest drawing of a rocket ship that morning. He deserved to know. And Christopher deserved to be held accountable. She took a deep breath, her resolve hardening like steel. I'm going to take their food order. Maria grabbed her arm. Are you sure I can take the table? Say you're sick. No, Kathy said, her voice steady now. I've been running from this for 5 years. I'm done running. She smoothed her apron, straightened her shoulders, and picked up her notepad. Walking back into the dining room felt like walking onto a stage for a performance she hadn't rehearsed. Every step was deliberate. As she approached table 7, she could feel their eyes on her. She kept her gaze fixed on the older man. Are you ready to order, sir? The man who Christopher had called father gave a curt nod. It was William Preston, the patriarch. Kathy recognized him from old business articles she'd compulsively read in the months after Christopher disappeared. He ordered the steak rare. The woman introduced as Genevieve ordered the sea bass. Then Kathy had no choice but to turn to him. And for you, sir, she forced herself to meet his eyes. For a split second there was nothing. Just the polite blank look of a customer addressing a servant. And then it happened. A flicker, a tiny, almost imperceptible widening of his glacier blue eyes. The smile on his face froze, and then melted away. His mouth parted slightly. Kathy, he whispered, his voice barely audible. The sound of her name from his lips after all this time was like a physical blow. William Preston's head snapped towards his son. You know this, Waitress. His tone was laced with ice and disapproval. Genevieve's perfectly manicured hand tightened on Christopher's arm. Her smile was gone, replaced by a look of sharp, suspicious inquiry. Christopher ignored them. He was staring at Kathy, his face a mask of disbelief. Kathy. My God, what are you? I looked for you. I tried to find you. A bitter laugh escaped Kathy's lips before she could stop it. You didn't look very hard. The lie was so audacious, so insulting, it burned away the last of her fear. The years of pain of single motherhood, of scraped-together rent payments and lonely nights, coalesced into a single point of white-hot anger. Christopher William said, his voice a low command. Do not make a scene. But Kathy was no longer a ghost. She was a reckoning. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice, so only the table could hear her, but the words were as sharp as broken glass. A scene you want to talk about scenes. Let's talk about disappearing without a word. Let's talk about disconnected phone numbers and bounced emails. Let's talk about promises you whispered in the dark. Kathy, I can explain. Christopher stammered, his face pale. It wasn't like that. Wasn't it? She felt a dangerous calm settle over her. She had one more card to play, one final devastating truth. She looked directly into his eyes, the eyes that haunted her son's face. He's 5 years old, she said, her voice clear and steady amidst the clinking of cutlery from the surrounding tables. His name is Leo. She paused, letting the words hang in the air, heavy and irreversible. And every single morning when he wakes up, I have to look at your eyes, staring back at me. Christopher recoiled as if she had struck him. Genevieve let go of his arm, her expression a mixture of shock and disgust. William Preston's face was a thundercloud of pure fury. Kathy straightened up her notepad, still in her hand. So what will it be for you, sir? She asked, her voice dripping with a professionalism that was more insulting than any scream could ever be. Or have you lost your appetite? The drive back to the Preston penthouse on Park Avenue was a tomb of silence. The air inside the chauffeured Bentley was thick with unspoken accusations. Genevieve sat pressed against the far door. Her arms crossed her gaze, fixed on the glittering, indifferent lights of Manhattan. William Preston stared straight ahead, his jaw so tight it looked like it might crack the very air. Christopher felt like he was suffocating. Kathy's words echoed in his head, a relentless, deafening loop. He's 5 years old. His name is Leo. A son. He had a son. The idea was so monumental, so reality-altering, that his mind couldn't fully grasp it. It was like trying to look directly at the sun. He'd spent 5 years building a narrative to explain Kathy's disappearance. She'd left him. She'd gotten scared of the intensity of their relationship, of what it meant for her to be with someone from his world. He'd told himself that she took the easy way out and simply vanished. It was a painful story, but it was one that left his ego intact. It made him the victim, the one who was abandoned. He'd searched, he'd told himself. He'd gone back to her apartment a week after he returned from Singapore, then 2 weeks. The landlord said she'd packed up and left without a forwarding address. Her phone was disconnected. It was a clean break. Over the years, the sharp pain had dulled into a melancholic ache, a ghost of a memory of a girl who painted sunflowers and laughed with her whole body. Now that carefully constructed narrative was in ruins. As soon as they stepped into the sterile art gallery white foyer of the penthouse, the silence broke. Well, William began, his voice dangerously low as he shrugged off his overcoat and handed it to a waiting housekeeper. That was a thoroughly disgusting spectacle. Don't talk about her like that, Christopher snapped, his voice raw. Her William spun on him, his face contorted with rage. That waitress who ambushed us tried to create a public scandal. That is exactly what I am talking about. I trust you will handle this, Christopher. Quietly. A check and non-disclosure agreement. Whatever it takes to make her and this situation go away. A situation, Christopher laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. Father, did you hear what she said? I have a son. You have an unsubstantiated claim from a manipulative, low-life girl you dallied with years ago, William retorted. She sees the Preston name and smells money. It's the oldest trick in the book. It was Kathy, Christopher insisted, shaking his head. She wasn't like that. You never met her, and I thank God for it every day, William sneered. This is insane. Genevieve finally spoke, her voice shaking with a fury that matched William's. She rounded on Christopher, her eyes blazing. You sat there and let that woman talk to us like that. You have a secret child, Christopher. A secret life you conveniently forgot to mention before asking me to marry you. It's not a secret life. Jen, I didn't know, he pleaded, running a hand through his hair. I thought she left me. I swear to you, I had no idea. Oh, you had no idea, she mocked. You just happened to have a Passio-Chris summer affair that resulted in a child, and it completely slipped your mind. How convenient. Was this before or after you told me you'd never truly been in love before me? The question hung in the air, sharp and poisonous. Christopher had no answer, because he had loved Kathy, desperately, and a part of him had never quite recovered. Lying to Genevieve about it had been an act of self-preservation, a way to bury the past and commit to the future his father had meticulously planned for him. This changes everything, Genevieve said, her voice turning cold and decisive. The wedding is off. The engagement is over. Now let's not be hasty, Genevieve. William interjected, his tone shifting from anger to strained diplomacy. Christopher was foolish. He was young. This is a mess, I grant you, but it's a manageable one. Our families have a history. The Sinclair-Preston merger is the only reason you tolerate me, and the only reason my father wants me to marry your philandering son, Genevieve, finished for him, her eyes flashing. Don't you dare talk to me about business right now, William. Your son just humiliated me. He has a child with a waitress. This isn't a line item on a balance sheet. This is my life. She looked at Christopher one last time, her expression unreadable. Have your lawyers call my lawyers. With that, she turned and walked out, slamming the grand penthouse door behind her. The sound echoed in the cavernous space. Christopher stood stunned before turning on his father. Are you happy now? This is what you wanted, isn't it? Some excuse to push Genevieve out. Don't be absurd. Genevieve is from a good family. But if she cannot handle a small crisis, she is not fit to be. A Preston, William said dismissively, walking towards the bar to pour himself a brandy. The point remains. You will deal with the waitress. You will determine if the claim is even valid, and I highly doubt it is, and you will pay her off. Sever all contact. She is not and never will be a part of this family. No, Christopher said, a new and unfamiliar strength rising within him. I'm not going to pay her off. I'm going to talk to her. I'm going to find out the truth. And I am going to meet my son. The defiance in Christopher's voice made William pause, his hand hovering over the crystal decanter. He turned slowly, a dark look crossing his features. You will do as you are told, Christopher. You are the CEO of Preston Corp, in name only. Do not forget who holds the real power. Do not make an enemy of me. You won't win. The threat was clear, cold, and absolute. But for the first time in his life, Christopher didn't flinch. The image of Kathy's face, the pain and anger in her eyes, had ignited something in him, a long dormant piece of the man he used to be. The man who painted with her, in a tiny, sun-drenched apartment, who believed in a future that wasn't mapped out by his father. The next morning, Kathy was a wreck. She'd been fired, of course. Mr. Henderson had done it with a sort of regretful pity. Kathy, you know I can't have my staff accosting the customers, especially not William Preston. A week's severance was all he could offer. She sat at her small kitchen table in her cramped Queen's apartment, the termination letter lying next to a pile of unpaid bills. Leo was on the floor, happily drawing planets and stars on a large sheet of paper, humming to himself. He was the only calm in her storm. "Mommy, look," he said, holding up his drawing. This is Saturn. It has rings. And this is Jupiter. It's the biggest. Kathy forced a smile, her heart aching. That's amazing, sweetie. You're such a good artist. He gets it from me, she thought. But he gets his eyes from his father. The injustice of it all was a physical weight. Christopher lived in a penthouse on Park Avenue, and she was about to be unable to make rent. He was worried about a broken engagement, and she was worried about buying groceries. A knock on the door made her jump. It was a sharp, hesitant rap. She wasn't expecting anyone. With a sense of dread, she peered through the peephole. It was him. Christopher stood in the dingy hallway of her apartment building, looking utterly out of place in another perfectly tailored suit. He looked tired, his hair slightly disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it all night. Her first instinct was to scream at him to leave. Her second was to slam the door in his face. But then she looked back at Leo sitting on the floor, oblivious. This was bigger than her anger now. She took a breath and opened the door, leaving the chain on. "What do you want, Kathy, please?" he said, his voice low and urgent. "Just give me 5 minutes. I need to talk to you. I need to explain. Explain how you became a ghost." It wasn't like that. He insisted, his blue eyes pleading. "I came back from Singapore. I went to your apartment. The landlord said you were gone. Your phone was dead. I thought you left me." Kathy stared at him, bewildered. "What are you talking about? I never left. I waited for you. I called and called. I was living in that apartment for 4 more months until I was evicted because I couldn't afford the rent on my own anymore." They stared at each other through the small gap in the door. Two people with 2 completely different versions of the same past. Both of them were convinced they were telling the truth. The anger in Kathy's face began to morph into confusion. His story, as impossible as it seemed, sounded genuine. The desperation in his eyes looked real. "Who was the landlord?" Christopher asked, his mind racing. "What was his name, Mr. Peterson?" Kathy said, "A short, weaselly man with a bad toupee." Christopher's face went pale. Peterson wasn't the landlord, Kathy. The building was owned by a subsidiary of a real estate company, a company my father had dealings with. The air grew cold. The implications of his words began to sink in, dark and terrifying. A disconnected phone, a landlord who lied, an eviction. It was all too convenient, too clean. From inside the apartment, a small voice called out. "Mommy, who's at the door?" Leo padded over his drawing, still in his hand. He peeked around Kathy's legs, his wide, curious eyes. Christopher's eyes landing on the stranger in the hallway. Christopher's breath hitched. He stared at the little boy, at the sandy blonde hair, the shape of his face, the impossible blue of his eyes. All the doubt, all the suspicion his father had tried to plant in his mind evaporated in an instant. This was his son. It was a truth more profound and undeniable than anything else in his life. Tears welled in Christopher's eyes. He looks just like—" "You," Kathy finished softly, her own anger dissolving into a shared, dawning horror. "He looks just like you." It wasn't a simple case of a man abandoning his pregnant girlfriend. It was something far more sinister. They hadn't been victims of a failed romance. They had been victims of a calculated, cruel deception, and they both had a strong suspicion of who was behind it. The apartment, once a fortress of Kathy's self-sufficiency, now felt like a fragile truce zone. Christopher stood awkwardly by the door, his expensive leather shoes looking absurd against the scuffed linoleum floor. Leo, after a moment of shyness, had decided this new tall person was interesting and was now showing him his drawing of the solar system. This one is Earth. That's where we live, Leo explained with the solemnity only a 5-year-old can muster. And that's Mars. It's the red one. Christopher knelt his suit jacket, bunching to get on Leo's level. His gaze was fixed on the boy with an intensity that was both heartbreaking and terrifying to Kathy. He wasn't just looking. He was absorbing every detail, trying to reclaim 5 years of lost time in a single moment. "It's an incredible drawing," Christopher said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're a very talented artist, Leo." Leo beamed. "My mummy is an artist too." The simple statement struck Christopher with a fresh wave of guilt. He looked at Kathy, who was watching them with her arms crossed, her expression a careful mixture of vigilance and sorrow. He remembered her sketchbooks, filled with vibrant charcoal portraits and dreamy landscapes. He remembered her dream of finishing her degree and having her own gallery one day. Instead, she was here in this small apartment, fired from a job she hated, all because of him and his father. "Kathy," he said, standing up, "we need to figure this out." "Figure what out?" she asked, her voice hard again. "That your father is a monster. I think we've established that." "I need proof," Christopher said. "My father, he's not just going to admit it. He's surrounded by lawyers and fixers. He's insulated. If I go to him with just our story, he'll paint you as a liar and me as a fool. He'll bury us." The word "us" hung in the air. It was a strange and foreign concept. For 5 years it had just been Kathy and Leo. An us that included Christopher felt impossible. "So what do you suggest?" she challenged. "We hire a private investigator. I can barely afford this month's rent, in case you haven't noticed." The bitterness was back, a protective shield she couldn't let go of. "Let me worry about the money," he said quickly. I'll take care of it. I can back pay the child support. All of it. And more. For your education, for—" "Stop," Kathy cut him off, holding up a hand. "Don't you dare try to throw money at this. This isn't about your guilt fund. This is about the truth. If you want my help to find it, then we do this as equals. Not as your charity case." Christopher nodded, humbled. "Okay, as equals." Their investigation began with a single crucial thread. Mr. Peterson, the fake landlord. Christopher made a call to a trusted contact in his company's legal department, a man named Robert Chen, who owed him a favor. He framed it as a query into a past real estate deal, being intentionally vague about the reasons. While they waited, Kathy dug through an old dusty box in her closet, the one that held the wreckage of her past life. She pulled out her old brick-like smartphone from 6 years ago. It was long dead, but the SIM card was still inside. She also found a handful of letters, the eviction notice, and a few formal-looking envelopes she'd never opened, assuming they were just more bills she couldn't pay. "I was so overwhelmed back then," she said quietly, her back to Christopher, as she sorted through the papers on her coffee table. "I was pregnant, sick all the time, and terrified. When the eviction notice came, I just packed what I could and left. I thought these were just final demands." She slit open one of the envelopes with a kitchen knife. It wasn't a bill. It was a letter from the registrar's office at her university, formally withdrawing her from her program due to non-payment and lack of contact. Another was from the student loan company beginning the collections process. Each one was a paper-cut reminder of the life that had been stolen from her. Christopher's phone buzzed. It was Robert Chen. He put it on speaker. "Okay, Chris, this is weird," Robert's voice said, tinny through the phone's speaker. "The building on Elm Street. It was owned by a shell corporation called Viridian Properties. I did some digging. Viridian was a short-term holding company dissolved 4 years ago. It was managed by a law firm, Barrow Finch, and associates. Christopher's blood ran cold. Barrow and Finch. "Yeah, why?" Robert asked. "They've been my father's personal attorneys for 30 years, Christopher said, looking at Cathy, whose eyes had gone wide. "There's more," Robert continued. "I pulled the wire transfer records for Viridian's account. The funds to purchase the building came directly from a private investment fund. The fund is called North Star Holdings." Christopher felt his stomach clench. He knew that name. "That's my father's private fund. The one he uses for off-the-books projects." "Looks like it," Robert said. "He bought the whole building, Chris. He didn't just have a word with the landlord. He was the landlord." The call ended, leaving a heavy silence in the room. The truth was far worse than they'd imagined. William Preston hadn't just interfered. He had orchestrated a meticulous, ruthless campaign to erase Cathy from Christopher's life. He'd bought the building she lived in, hired a man to imperso. Chris, the landlord, had her phone disconnected and forced her eviction, ensuring that when Christopher returned, all traces of her would be gone. It was a level of control that was sociopathic. "He wanted you desperate," Christopher said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "He wanted you with no money, no home, no school. He wanted to break you so you'd have no choice but to disappear." Tears streamed down Cathy's face, silent and hot. It wasn't just heartbreak anymore, it was a violation. Her life, her choices, her future, all of it had been manipulated by a man she'd never even met. A man who saw her as nothing more than an inconvenience. Just then, Cathy's fingers brushed against a different kind of paper in the box. It wasn't a letter. It was a photograph, one she'd forgotten she even had. It was of her and Christopher, taken in a photo booth on Coney Island. They were squeezed together, laughing, Christopher's arm wrapped tightly around her. In the last frame, he was kissing her cheek, and she was looking at the camera with a look of pure, unadulterated happiness. She slid it across the table. Christopher picked it up. He stared at the image of the boy he had been, the girl she had been. The carefree joy in the photograph was a stark, brutal contrast to the cold reality of their present. "We have to expose him," Cathy said, her voice trembling but firm. "He can't get away with this. Not just for us. For Leo. My son will not grow up as the dirty little secret of a man like William Preston." Christopher's jaw was set, his knuckles white as he clutched the photo strip. The final piece of his loyalty to his father had just been incinerated. This was no longer just about rectifying a past wrong. It was about war. "There's someone," Christopher said, his mind working furiously. "A man who used to be my father's executive assistant. A man named David Channing. My father fired him in disgrace a few years ago over a trumped-up expense report issue. In reality, Channing knew too much. He was there during that time. If anyone has concrete evidence, an email, a memo, anything, it would be him. And where do we find this David Channing?" "I have no idea," Christopher admitted. "But I know how to find out. His plan was risky. It involved using his CEO-level access to the Preston Corp servers to search old HR records for Channing's last known address. It was an action that would be logged, an action his father would almost certainly see. It was the first overt move in their war, a clear signal that Christopher was no longer playing by his father's rules. While Christopher worked on his laptop, his face illumicrised by the screen's glow, Cathy sat with Leo, who had fallen asleep on the couch, his head in her lap. She stroked his soft hair, her heart a painful mix of love and rage. She looked over at Christopher, this man who was both a stranger and the other half of her son. He was risking his career, his inheritance, his entire world, to unearth a truth his father had buried with concrete and steel. For the first time in 5 years, she wasn't entirely alone in her fight. An hour later, Christopher looked up from his computer, his expression grim but triumphant. "I've got it. An address in Jersey City. And something else. His termination was finalized by a direct order from my father. Reason cited, gross misconduct and breach of trust. My father wasn't just firing him. He was destroying his reputation to ensure he'd never work in the corporate world again. He was silencing him, Kathy said. Exactly, Christopher agreed, which means Mr. Channing might just be motivated to talk. The air in the downtown Jersey City coffee shop was thick with the scent of burnt espresso and the low hum of a dozen disconnected conversations. It was a perfectly anonymous space, a world away from the gleaming towers of Preston Corp and the hushed elegance of Aurelia. David Channing, a man who looked like he had been carrying the weight of the world for years, sat hunched over a lukewarm cup of coffee. His eyes, weary and bloodshot, darted towards the door with every new customer, his shoulders slumped in a posture of perpetual defeat. "I shouldn't have come," he mumbled, his voice, a raspy whisper that barely carried over the clatter of ceramic. "You don't understand, William Preston. He doesn't just fire people, he erases them." Another conversation with him, even indirectly, feels like tempting fate. Kathy sat opposite him, her hands folded calmly on the table. She had spent the last 5 years feeling powerless, but sitting here on the offensive, she felt a strange and unfamiliar steadiness. "Mr. Channing, he's already ruined our lives," she said, her voice even and clear. "We're not asking you to tempt fate. We're asking you to help us reclaim what was stolen." She slid a slim folder across the worn wooden table. It wasn't an accusation. It was an invitation into their truth. Inside, Channing saw the meticulously gathered evidence of their morning's work, the deed to her former apartment building, registered to Viridian Properties, the printout of the wire transfer from the North Star Holdings Fund, and finally the faded photo booth strip from Coney Island. Channing's long fingers, stained with ink at the cuticles, trembled slightly as he picked up the photograph. He stared at the images of the laughing, carefree couple, a ghost of a memory flickering in his tired eyes. "I remember you," he said, his gaze shifting to Christopher. It wasn't an accusation, but a sad confirmation. The art student. "Your father was incandescent with rage. I'd never seen him like that. He believed you were derailing the grand plan. He called you a nobody with paint under her fingernails, said you were a temporary distraction that was becoming a liability." The callous words relayed after all these years sent a fresh wave of hot anger through Kathy's veins. It was the casual cruelty, the complete dismissal of her as a human being, that still had the power to wound. "We know he orchestrated it all," Christopher pressed, leaning forward, his voice low and urgent. "But his fingerprints aren't anywhere on this. It's a labyrinth of shell corporations and lawyers. We need a direct link, something with his name on it. An email, a memo, a recording, anything that proves he gave the order." Channing lapsed into a long, heavy silence, his eyes fixed on the dark swirl of his coffee, as if searching for an answer in its depths. He was always so careful he murmured more to himself than to them, a master of plausible deniability. Everything was a verbal command. "Handle this. Take care of that situation." He never left a trail. He took a shaky sip from his cup. "When he fired me, he had 2 security guards escort me from my desk to the front door. They took my company phone, my laptop, even my Rolodex. I left with nothing but a box of personal effects." Kathy's heart sank. The thread had run cold. They had come so far only to be stopped by the very same wall of power and influence that had separated them in the first place. But Channing's voice dropped even lower, and a sly, almost feral glint appeared in his eye. It was the look of a man who had nursed a grievance for a very long time. William has a fatal flaw: arrogance. He thinks everyone who works for him is a simple-minded sycophant. He never imagined, not for a second, that his meek little executive assistant would have the foresight to create an insurance policy. A current of electricity passed between Kathy and Christopher. For years I was too terrified to even think about using it. Channing confessed his voice, gaining a sliver of its former strength. He destroyed my reputation. I couldn't get a job in this city for 3 years. But seeing this, he tapped the folder with his finger. Seeing what he did to you, to a child he's never met. That man does not deserve my loyalty. He does not deserve my silence. He reached into the worn leather briefcase at his feet, his movements deliberate. He pulled out a small, slim USB drive and placed it on the table. It was black and unremarkable, yet it felt like the heaviest object in the room. This drive contains copies of the most sensitive emails I forwarded to a private encrypted address over my last 2 years at Preston Corp, he explained. Everything is on here. The illegal union-busting operation in the Philippines, the back-channel deals to bankrupt a competitor, and... He paused, making direct eye contact with Christopher. A detailed email thread from 6 years ago. The subject line is simply, "The Christopher Situation." It's an email from your father to John Barrow, his personal attorney. It explicitly authorizes Barrow to act on behalf of Viridian Properties and to take all necessary measures to termy Chris the distraction permanently and discreetly. It's the smoking gun. It's not just his reputation. It's his head on a platter. Christopher reached out and picked up the drive. The cool plastic felt momentous in his palm. He will try to destroy you for this. You know he said the words, both a warning and a statement of fact. A bitter smile touched Channing's lips. He already did, he replied. Now it's my turn to return the favor. Just promise me one thing. When you bring him down, make sure the entire world knows exactly why. That evening, the silent mirrored elevator of the Park Avenue penthouse ascended like a rocket, carrying Kathy and Christopher towards the final confrontation. Leo was with Maria, who had been sworn to secrecy, and paid handsomely for a night of babysitting that was more than it seemed. For Kathy, the journey upward was surreal. She looked at her own reflection, a woman in a simple but determined black dress, a stark contrast to the opulence surrounding her. This gleaming tower was the very symbol of the wealth and power that had crushed her dreams and kept her from the man standing beside her. She wasn't here as a victim anymore. She was here as a warrior, armed with the truth. Christopher stood silently, the USB drive a cold, hard weight in his pocket. He had called for an emergency family meeting, his voice on the phone, leaving no room for argument. It was urgent, he had said, and Genevieve needed to be there. To his surprise, she had agreed, her tone icy and clipped. They were no longer a bitter waitress and a guilt-ridden executive. They were partners, soldiers in a war of their own, marching toward the enemy's stronghold. The elevator doors opened into the vast, gallery-white living room. William Preston stood by the roaring fireplace, a heavy crystal glass of scotch in his hand, the very picture of patriarchal authority. Across the room, Genevieve sat ramrod straight on a sterile white sofa, her face a pale, composed mask. Beside her, acting as a stern reinforcement, stood her father, Robert Sinclair, a man whose formidable reputation in the business world preceded him. Christopher William began his voice, a low growl of condescension. What is the meaning of this late-night melodrama? And why in God's name have you brought her here? He gestured dismissively toward Kathy with his glass, as if she were a piece of dirt he'd found on his shoe. "She has a name," Christopher shot back, his voice echoing in the cavernous room, sharp with an authority his father had never heard before. "It's Kathy, and she is here because this concerns her more than anyone else in this room." "I have had quite enough of this absurd spectacle," William boomed, taking a step forward. "I have had my lawyers reach out with a generous settlement offer, a 7-figure sum which is far more than she deserves. If she is here to try and extort more—" "We are not here for your money," Father Christopher interrupted his voice, cutting through William's tirade. He crossed the room to the enormous smart television mounted on the wall and, with a steady hand, inserted the USB drive into its port. "We're here for a reckoning." With a single click of the remote, the massive screen flickered to life. The image that appeared was not a movie or a news channel, but the stark black and white text of an email. From W. Preston to J. Barrow. Subject: The Christopher Situation. John. As we discussed, you are hereby authorized to act as the primary agent for the Viridian Properties entity. The objective is the complete and discreet termination of the current distraction. You are cleared to use the North Star funds for this purpose. Purchase the primary asset disconnect all lines of external communication and ensure she is gone before Christopher returns from his Singapore trip. I expect this to be handled with your usual efficiency and discretion. Under no circumstances can this be traced back to us. I trust your judgment regarding the necessary incentives to motivate the building manager. W. A thick, suffocating silence descended upon the room. Robert Sinclair, a man who understood the brutal nuances of corporate power, instinctively took a half-step away from William, as if the man had suddenly become radioactive. Genevieve's eyes darted from the screen to William, her carefully constructed composure cracking to reveal pure, undiluted revulsion. The Scotch glass slipped from William's nerveless fingers, shattering on the cold marble floor, with a sound that seemed to echo the shattering of his entire world. His face, usually ruddy with power and privilege, had turned a ghastly, bloodless white. This is a fabrication," he stammered, his booming voice reduced to a weak, reedy rasp. "A forgery, that man Channing. He was a disgruntled employee, a thief. Was he, Christopher, counted his own voice like ice? Or was he just your loyal accomplice for 2 decades? Did you truly believe you could orchestrate something so monstrously cruel and leave no trace? Did you honestly think I was that stupid, or that I would remain weak forever?" He turned his gaze to Kathy, who stood tall and unbowed, her eyes locked on William. There were no tears on her face, only a cold, righteous fire that had been simmering for 5 long years. "You didn't just lie to me," Christopher continued, turning back to his father, the words dripping with the pain of a lifetime of manipulation. "You stole my son from me. You stole 5 years of his life that I can never get back. You took the woman I loved, and you tried to break her, to cast her out like she was nothing. And for what? For a merger, for the precious family name. You were a boy." William finally roared, a desperate, cornered animal lashing out. "You were besotted. You were going to ruin everything I built for you, for some little tramp from nowhere." Before Christopher or anyone else could react, Kathy stepped forward. Her presence seemed to command the space, her quiet dignity eclipsing William's blustering rage. "That tramp from nowhere raised your grandson," she said, her voice soft, but carrying more weight than William's shout. "I raised him alone. I worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, to keep a roof over his head and food on his table. I stayed up with him through fevers and held him when he had nightmares. I was the one who taught him how to read, who cheered for his crayon drawings of rocket ships. While you were sitting in this palace, insulated from reality, and worried about your stock portfolio, I was raising a kind, brilliant, and happy little boy. He is everything good that you are not. And I promise you this, you will never ever be a part of his life. The final devastating blow came not from Kathy or Christopher, but from Genevieve. She rose from the sofa, her composure absolute and chilling. "The merger is off, William," she announced, her voice as clear and cutting as a diamond. "My father and I will not be doing business with a man like you. The Sinclair name will not be associated with this kind of filth." She then turned to Christopher, and for the first time that night, a flicker of something that looked almost like respect entered her eyes. "And the engagement is, of course, most definitely over. But Christopher, good for you for finally standing up to him." With that, she and her father turned and walked out of the penthouse without a single backward glance, the heavy door closing behind them with a quiet, final click. William Preston stood alone amidst the ruins of his empire, a pathetic, diminished figure surrounded by shattered glass and shattered lies. He stared at his son, his face a contorted mask of fury and utter disbelief. "You've ruined me," he whispered, the words barely audible. "No," Christopher replied, stepping over to stand beside Kathy, a united front. "You ruined yourself. I'm just turning on the lights." And so our story draws to a close, not with the clean, satisfying snap of a fairy tale ending, but with the quiet, hopeful, and infinitely more complex start of a new chapter. The path forward for Kathy, Christopher, and Leo is not paved with restored fortunes or a sudden romance, but with the painstaking day-by-day process of rebuilding a family from the wreckage of a profound betrayal. Their journey serves as a powerful testament to several truths. It reveals how the most devastating wounds are often inflicted not by strangers, but from within the very family circle meant to provide protection and love. We witnessed how a lifetime of power built on control and fear, like that of William Preston, can be undone by a single, undeniable truth. It is a raw and potent reminder that this truth, no matter how deeply it is buried beneath layers of wealth and influence, has a way of fighting its way into the light. Above all, this story champions the idea that true strength is not measured by stock portfolios or corporate titles, but by resilience, integrity, and the fierce, unwavering love you are willing to fight for. This leaves us with lingering questions about their unwritten future. What do you believe will happen to them next? Can a family born from such a calculated and painful deception ever truly heal and find its own version of peace? Can Christopher, through the patient daily acts of fatherhood, ever fully earn back the trust that was so cruelly stolen from Kathy years ago? Let us know your thoughts and predictions in the comments below. If this story of resilience, justice, and the complex path to forgiveness moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button and sharing it with someone who appreciates a drama that feels true to life. Don't forget to subscribe for more compelling stories that explore the depths of the human heart. Your support is what allows us to continue finding and sharing these incredible narratives with you. Thank you for listening.